Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AA-ISP webinar series. Thanks so much for joining. We have a huge turnout today. In fact, rumor has it that a couple of office dogs actually registered. I forget their name, but I know we have a lot of people today, and it's a great topic. In fact, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. It has to do with personalization. This is near and dear to my heart. In fact, 2 years ago, the AA-ISP, the Global Inside Sales Association, announced the year of personalization, but a lot of people still didn't get it right. Well, today, you're in for a real treat. With us, we have Becc Holland. Becc, welcome.
Hi, Bob. How's it going?
It's going great, and Becc is going to talk about how to make this prospect-centric, personalized outreach. She's going to share a lot of tips, best practices. Some of you may be familiar with Becc. She's a real power user on LinkedIn, a thought leader, has been around the industry. Chorus, she works as head of sales development. Chorus has been a tremendous association and community supporter and sponsor, and we're super excited and honored to be working with Chorus and Becc today. So Becc, let's get us started on this great topic.
Awesome. First off, I'm just super excited to be here. Hi, everyone on the webinar. My name is Becc Holland. Like Bob mentioned, I'm the head of sales development for Chorus.ai. I saw that piece that said thought leader above my name, and I don't know if I can quite live up to that today, but I'll do my best. So when it comes to personalization, I've typically seen one of two camps, people within one of two camps in the sales industry and sales development representative industry. The first camp is a camp of users that say like, hey, we love personalization and it gives us great results, but we stick with mass blast because you can't control messaging, you can't maintain consistency. I have new and onboarding SDRs and AEs. I'm not comfortable, that they can really adequately talk about my product yet. And so they want to stick with scripts because, it maintains consistency of messaging and they can be sure of the kind of scripts that are rolling out. The other camp of messaging, system that people rely on is personalized messaging. This is the, I would say, lesser part of the community. Very few reps are personalizing at this point to date. So I see, best case scenario buyer persona templates based on buyer persona, or I see them based on maybe industry segment or vertical, but, the personalized reps say, yeah, the volume isn't super high for personalized messaging, but the personalization is bringing me in so many meetings and results. And so I've seen a couple of different programs start to flirt with that idea, like you mentioned, of like, okay, we need to personalize and we need to figure out a way to do it. So if you don't mind, we wanted to hold, all the questions, if there are any, to the end. But Bob, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you, some questions throughout this webinar, if you don't mind.
Not a problem at all.
Okay, great. So let's start with this one. Bob, by and large, do you respond to mass blast, unpersonalized emails by taking a meeting?
Oh, every single one. No, not at all. In fact, fortunately, some of them, not all, get caught in my other folder, so out of sight, out of mind, but rarely, if ever, unless it gets my attention with something about me.
Okay, great. So, second question, follow-up question to that. Do you think your prospects are different than you are in that regard?
No.
So those are the two questions that I had to ask myself whenever I kind of embarked on this journey. So my background, I was an AE, twice over enterprise AE, and actually became an SDR whenever I transferred out to the Bay Area to learn a little bit more about the ecosystem first. And I remember just doing, sales SDR work for 7 months there. And at the end, I just walked home one day and walked into my apartment. And I just remember lying on my floor, true story, and just staring at the ceiling and asking myself those two questions because I wasn't getting the results that I want. So the first question I asked myself was, do I respond to any kind of mass blast messaging? And I'm like, no, I never do. Like, I can't think of the last time that I did. And the second, question was, do I think my prospects are different than me? And my hunch was no, I don't think that my prospects are different than me. So that was the point that I would say changed my career and helped me realize that like I had to find a way to personalize at scale. So that was the beginning of the journey. But when it comes to personalizing messaging, I think the two things that you need to scale anything are you first need a prototype and a structure on a small scale, and then you need to learn how to put gas to that prototype. So the first, as far as an agenda, the first thing I wanted to cover is how to structure picking a premise for outreach. What about the person you can pick out to make them respond with taking a meeting with higher or lower trigger rates? The second piece of the agenda for the exhorting of the presentation is how to, over emails and cold calls, intertwine that personalization to make them say, okay, I want to meet with your firm. And then the third piece, we're going to go into how to scale it, how to put gas on that, and how to, scale that type of messaging throughout with a sales engagement platform. So the first part is, how do we pick a reason for outreach? So before I segregated any of these different buckets, I basically did a deep dive study into the 4 kinds of graphics, as I call them. So the first kind of graphic is demographics. It's a B2C predilection. It's like, okay, what's your age? What's your gender, your education level? Or what about this consumer? How can I segment my consumers based on something that's individualistic? The second kind of graphic that I had segmented on beforehand, before personalizing, is firmographics. Anything about a company, whether that's industry vertical or product sophistication or funding or competitors. The third kind of graphic that I had segmented on in the past is technographic. So what kind of tech stack does this person use? Do they use a sales engagement vendor or a data provider? Do they use any kind of chat box like Intercom or Drift? And that is basically the extent to where most people see personalization. They see personalization as I'm going to, segment based on the company, segment based on their profession of like their accounting versus sales development, or I'm going to segment them based on the kind of tech they're using. But there's this fourth category and column called psychographics, and that's basically everything that someone is interested in, everything someone believes, has an attitude towards. So it's all of that meaty capital of what someone thinks about in their day-to-day. And so that my hunch and my theory before I proved it out with a couple programs was, if I dip into that bucket, I'm probably going to get a higher trigger rate. Like if I talk about Bob specific, as opposed to talking about AA-ISP or what kind of vertical you guys are in, or your role at the foundation, I think that if I talk about something that Bob cares about, specifically, then I'm going to get a higher trigger rate. So I basically made an exhaustive list. I got a huge sheet of paper and a purple marker, and I made an exhaustive list of all the reasons that you could reach out to someone based on. So I came up with the 5 following buckets, and we'll start with the bucket that has the highest engagement rate in my experience down to the lowest engagement rate in beta tests. So let's get going. The first bucket is self-authored content. So this is anything that your prospect authored. So whether it's a webinar like this, or some kind of article that they wrote, or some kind of post they made on LinkedIn. Little asterisk side note: the majority of this content that I'm reaching out based on, I source through LinkedIn to really get to know my buyer. But this is anything that the prospect actually authored themselves, that stood out to you. So this has a 95% conversion in my experience of like, okay, I'm going to talk to Bob about, a podcast that he did earlier this year, and I'm going to tease out one line that stood out to me to prove to Bob this couldn't be a mass blast, but this is actually, me talking to Bob as a human being. The second bucket that I go into, if I can't find anything in the self-authored content, we'll go into a little bit later the rules of engagement. But I always suggest that whatever premise you pick, you're stuck with for the rest of the email. So instead of doing the 10-80-10 rule, I've seen a lot of outreach structured like this, of like 10% is personalized, 80% isn't, and then 10 is. And in my experience, what that happens there is like, hey, Becc, I noticed that you went to Texas A&M. We over here at Drift help blah, blah, blah. And I'm wondering like, okay, great. I did go to Texas A&M, me and 50,000 other people every single calendar year. What's your point? So I always want to urge my reps and anyone who's self-prospecting to make a hook that whatever premise that you're talking about, if I'm going to reach out to Bob and talk to him about, hi, Bob, I noticed from your Twitter account that you really like pizza. I better be ready to justify how Chorus relates to your love for pizza. So I'm kind of landlocked with whatever premise that I pick there. So second bucket is engaged content. It's not quite as heavy hitting as self-authored content, but it's still very relevant. So this is any kind of, content that they engage with, whether that was they liked it or they shared it or they commented on it. And then the third bucket is self-attributed traits. Self-attributed traits is my favorite bucket because it's something that someone wrote about themselves. So, you'll see them all on LinkedIn saying, Becc is a great leader at scaling sales orgs, et cetera, but it's within their profile line, their headline on LinkedIn, or their company line. For instance, in my case, it says a homegrown Texan that innately believes that hiring the right people is just as important as developing them. So the crazy thing is, just kind of a little anecdote here, I probably get in the realm of 3 to 5 recruiting emails per week. And I've never seen one recruiter reach out to me and say, hi, Becc, I noticed that you really like developing people. That's a focus of yours in your career path. We over here at, Intercom, have the exact same culture. What if that could be a main focus of yours in your tenure, for this open job rec? So, self-attributed traits is really an interesting bucket because you're able to talk about what the person cares about via what they said that they care about on their LinkedIn profile. So it kind of psychologically poses to them either A, you care about this, or B, you were, lying on LinkedIn about what you care about. So I really like this bucket because it helps me understand at a high level, what are the things that this person's involved with in their day-to-day. I mean, from what I've seen, they're viewing that LinkedIn profile as a resume. So they're talking very, strategically about themselves and what they care about. But I like to mirror that back to them and say, like, I saw your drive at Oracle over towards, scaling effective teams. So that's the first 3 buckets. Usually I can tease out a premise about 90% of the time, I'd say, in those first 3 buckets. But if I can't, then I move on to the fourth premise bucket, is what I affectionately call the junk drawer. So the junk drawer is any kind of, schools that they attended, personal interests, hobbies, any kind of fun things about them. I've seen recommendations be thrown in here of like, hi, Bob, I saw this person, recommended you the other day on LinkedIn. But again, I would say, full disclosure, before we get into the meat of how to work this into an email, the premise into an email or a cold call, whatever premise that I pick, again, I'm going to have to be married to throughout the rest of the message. So if I pick, my love for wine or, Bob's love for football, then I need to justify how my company relates to football. So great case for Chorus, for instance. I saw a rep of mine the other day send out a message that say, hi, I noticed that you are really into this football team. What if you could turn all of your, bench players into your starting lineup using Chorus AI and your sales team over at Oracle? So
that's a pretty good one. I'd love to share one that actually happened to me if I could back.
Of course.
This was like 7 years ago, before we were all talking about personalization.
Yeah.
And the rep got me on the phone and said, hey, Bob, how are you? I don't think we've met, but I just learned about your leadership summit last week, and congratulations. I heard it was a good turnout. I go, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I also understand one of the keynotes was on training. In fact, that's the reason I'm calling. We're a training firm.
Yeah.
I'd love to pick your brain. This person had me at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I think that the important part there is that you're doing something that most reps don't take the time to do. So I've been asked in the past, I've built a couple of programs. I went from Adjust to Gong onto G2 Crowd, and then finally here at Chorus. And, I kind of have the internal reputation of turning the programs around very quickly. And I'm like, hey, we're doing something, my idea in the beginning is like, let's do something interesting and let's do something that no one else is really doing in the industry. Again, they're doing like buyer persona, but to me, when someone leads with a personal piece of data about me, like you said, of like, hey, the leadership summit, and training, like it perks up our ears, and, at a base level, it kind of strokes my ego a little bit of like, you were, a part of this content, you really like this content. So I do have a question of, Bob, whenever you do any kind of webinar or any kind of post on LinkedIn, what do you want to happen with that post or with that webinar?
Well, of course, you want to get it viewed a lot. You'd like to get some reaction to it, some comments, things like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Same here. So we're looking for some kind of validation through the way of engagement, whether that's likes or shares or comments. We crave, that this resonates with people, that whatever we're doing resonates with people. So whenever you reach out to someone and you say, not only did I watch your content, at a base level, it resonated with me. And here's a line that changed my career. I've talked to, I remember there is an SVP, and I won't mention what company he's with, but I got to reach out to him and say, hey, whenever I was deploying this personalized outreach, you don't know me, but I know you, whenever I was deploying this personalized outreach and I had the hunch that it would help with our numbers, you were the first person to receive a piece of personalized outreach. And his response was unbelievable. He was like, this is the best email I've ever seen. He went to LinkedIn and made a post about it. And I told him, I used your reaction to justify to my C-level that we should turn the program around from 100 cold calls and 50 emails to 10 emails and 20 cold calls, and using your outreach. And when I did, I 4X'd my numbers overnight because of your response. So whenever I did that, I got an immediate response from him, of like, hey, what you're doing matters to me. And so at a base level, it's like, I'm an old school seller from Texas. I'm an AE. And that's what I used to do in the past of like, I want to take away that marketing mass blast feel of like, I can use them for campaigns. But when it comes to a human being that I'm looking to strike rapport up with and have a personal relationship, just in my experience, I cannot lead with some kind of generic broad stroked messaging. I need to tease out something that matters to them. Becc, you hit the nail on the head with something. I want the viewers to listen to this. You said you went down from 100 calls and 50 emails or whatever, and you decreased that. The thing is, if you're still saying more activity yields more results, you're not getting it right. Yeah.
And, unless it's good activity, quality, personalized, right? And I know you're going to talk about that, but
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Trish Bertuzzi and the Bridge Group, they cut a report on average metrics. And so the average cold caller makes anywhere from 47 to 52 cold calls per day. And so when I cut my team down to 10 emails and 20 cold calls, I 4X their numbers within 2 weeks. And then I thought,
you did it with the personalization though, right?
Right. Exactly. And then I thought, okay, now I know that this works in terms of prototype. How can I bump that up to get that into normal cold calls? So my reps today at Chorus are sending 25 emails and making 50 cold calls per day, all personalized. So they're actually matching the average activity metric for a mass blaster with all personalized email, which is just really exciting. So just a little credit and shout out to them, even with the team, I have a team of 5, 4 of them are brand new to sales development and they are ramping. And we over doubled the best month that we've ever had, that they've had in this year with the 4 ramping reps that are brand new to sales development. We over doubled the KPI that for the best month that we've ever had to date. So, it's how do we put some rules of engagement around personalization? But at the base level, I'm like, I really wanted to figure out how to do this because I'm like, if I can put some structure around it and learn how to put gas around it, I'm going to harness the power of, all of that meaty capital. And instead of, I mentioned flip the script. Flipping the script for me is flipping from, all mass blast to all personalization. And more importantly, flipping from talking all about me as a company to talking 100% about my buyer.
You said something earlier that I didn't mention. You said lead with it. And I love that, Becc. You don't talk about you first, talk about them first, right?
Totally.
Great.
Yeah.
So you're going to get into some of these
Yes.
things, how we get there. Okay, good.
I will. So the fifth one, the last bucket that I use is company, and that is M&A, any kind of post, blogs, hiring, website language. Again, I'd say the rules of engagement here are, because SDRs have tried to make it look like it was personalized when it was still mass blast, you'll see a lot of emails that say, "Hi, Bob, I noticed that your company's growing." So the difference between that and a personalization, I always warn people to make sure that you trigger to them that it had to be personalized. So instead of saying, "I notice your company is growing," the difference between that and saying, "I noticed your company grew 63% over the last 6 months and you just hired 17 new reps and a VP of sales. So I was curious to know if you came across course before." One tells me it could be a carpet bomb. One tells me that it's 100% tailored to me. So this is firmographic only. So oddly enough, this is my lowest trigger rate is company. So those are in high level, the 5 buckets. Let's get into postbound premises. Postbound premises are anything in between true inbound and true outbound. True inbound is a demo request. True outbound is someone who's never heard of me. Postbound, I got the term of a post in basketball sits somewhere between the top of the key and the basket. So postbound is a lead that has heard of my company, but isn't actually a hand raiser yet. So great examples on the left, are things that I would, postbound premises I would use in messaging are white papers, ebooks, resource downloads, webinar registrants, webinar attendees, a past user. They demoed in the past. And what's important here is I've seen a lot of people in the industry blast out a lot of messaging of like, hey, Bob, I noticed that you went to the Personalization at Scale webinar. Do you want a meeting? And the problem with that is if they wanted a meeting, they usually have a nice, neat demo request on the side of their computer that says, I want to request a demo. So I have my reps use a postbound premise for context. I have them transition with the words, but more importantly, and then flip to an outbound premise. So I'm like, okay, that's what I do in what I call premise pairing. If I have a postbound premise like you see below, then again, I mentioned that of, "Hi, Bob, I noticed that you went to, attended the Personalization at Scale webinar, but more importantly, I saw this article that you wrote on LinkedIn the other day where you're talking about scaling effective teams. So I was curious to know if you came across course before." So the important part there is you're like, I'm going to mention this for context, but I certainly am not going to rest on it for, I don't have the gall to think that that is enough to book a meeting with you, because if you've heard of my product, you listened to a webinar and you didn't book a demo, there's usually a reason. And that reason we like to call in sales is a big fat objection. So I train that team very heavily on objection handling, whether that's shallow objections, like I'm running into a meeting, or a deeper objection of like, we're putting out an RFP, within Q4 and, on and on, or no budget. But if I don't have a postbound premise like I have located here, then I usually give a bucket premise summary and then one excerpt of, "Hi, Bob, reason for my outreach is I saw you wrote this article the other day, on scaling effective teams. One line that stood out to me was, when it comes to scaling teams, it's all about the conversations your team is having." So I like to give them, I've even seen outreach to me of like, "Hey, Becc, I was a part of your webinar." And I'm like, "Cool, what'd you like?" And they're like, I'm like, you're like, I'm a little sad and
But they didn't know they were talking to the world expert in this area.
I'm like, "Hey man, you can't BS a BSer, so to say. Like, if you liked my webinar, or tell me one thing that stood out to you so I can uncover, I've heard the phrase like the devil's in the details of, when someone's trying to figure out if someone's lying or not within a crime case, they typically separate the parties and they ask them a bunch of questions to tease out details. So, I like to present to my prospects like, "Hey, I'm different than 95% of every single other, maybe higher, probably 99% of every single other cold caller out there, because I took the time to research you." So go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Becc. Just wanted to, Yep, wanted to get one comment here, but later in the webinar, will you touch on the approximate time and effort it takes to do the research for?
I absolutely will. So I typically do, I mean, just a little tidbit, I typically do all tailored outreach all the time. And it takes me 5 minutes to source about 4 to 5 different premises for the person. So my first step within my sequence is research the person on LinkedIn. And I tease out 4 or 5 different premises, and we'll get in how to store those within a sales engagement vendor later, so that every single time I call Bob, you know, that juicy, you know, data surfaces to the top. But I mean, the short answer to the question is it takes me 5 minutes to research 4 to 5 different personalized premises. So now we've covered how to pick out a premise. Let's get into the structure of emails. For the structure of emails, I typically take a page out of the rule book of Chuck Jones. Chuck Jones is he was the author of Acme and the Rules of Animation. And Chuck Jones is famous for whenever he was little, he actually lived in Spokane, Washington with his father, and his father moved him down to Los Angeles. And Chuck Jones, his dad was really unsuccessful at business, and he got fired all the time. And so every single new company that he worked for, true story, he would take new letterhead and he'd put the name of the company at the top, and he'd put the name of the company on pencils. And whenever he got fired, he would give all of those materials to Chuck Jones and say, use them up however you can. So Chuck Jones drew in the realm of 200,000 drawings in his lifetime. And he said after about 100,000, instead of focusing on the actual drawing, he started focusing on the rules of engagement and the rules of animation. So for instance, you know, if I'm going to turn an animal into a character, these are the rules. Or a head should look like this, or an arm should look like this. And so when it came to Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, he was smart enough to know that he wasn't the genesis of all creative power. So he wanted to hire a really smart, driven team around him, but he also wanted to make sure they are within a set of rules. So, you know, the 9 rules are listed here on this slide. I mean, a couple of examples: the Roadrunner can't harm the coyote except by going beep, beep. Whenever possible, rule number 8, whenever possible, gravity is the coyote's biggest enemy. You know, rule 9, the coyote's always more humiliated than harmed. And when I think back to all of these different Wile E. Coyote episodes, every single one of them fits within these rules. So how that ties into personalization is, you know, I certainly wasn't threatened, but I certainly wasn't threatened and wasn't scared of hiring super smart people around me and then giving them the room to come up with ideas for themselves. So, you know, it creates this really great relationship of they're saying, thank you so much for the rules. And I'm saying, all the premises you actually picked out yourself. So I just gave you a little bit of direction, but the person who came up with the idea was you. So the rules of engagement that I put around emailing are the following. The first line, I actually take a page out of MJ Hoffman's playbook for this with the F-shaped email. He's the author of Why You Now. And the first line is the premise line, and it should be the longest line. Not paragraph, but line of your email. And so you should cover the reason that you reached out. So Google did a study on how you actually read emails, and prospects typically start on laptop, at least on desktop, they start at 2 o'clock for the email, and then they wrap around clockwise. So what that tells you about how your prospects read your email is they start at the end of who you are. They then loop around to the end of your CTA. They then loop around to the beginning of your CTA, and then finally onto the body. So they want to know who you are and what you want before they ever get into what your company does. So that's where we want to focus and zero in on creating personalization, because if you don't capture them in that first line and let them know that it's all about them, then they won't even get to step 2 of checking out what you want, or step 3 about what your company does. So the second line of the email I typically do is the body. The body is going to be the value prop of what your company does. And I have my reps over here focus on what value we drive for our user and also what pain we alleviate versus the features of what our company does. So I'm sure, Bob, you've come across this before in the past, but Sandler's selling methodology talks about how the beginner's luck curve is because in the beginning, you don't know anything about your product. So you ask your prospect a bunch of questions. In the middle section, you go into a slump because you learn about your product and you start talking about all the wonderful things that you know, and the prospect is quiet, and that the veteran rep does what they did in the beginning, but they do it on purpose. Bob, were you gonna being in there?
Yeah, no, I've been there, done it. I've been on the receiving end of that as well, and it can be a challenge.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and I think especially younger in your career, whenever you're in the SDR role, typically, it's like you want to talk about, you're excited, so you want to talk about all the wonderful things how your company does it. So I have my reps, instead of focusing on the how, focus on the pains that they alleviate for the different buyer personas they're reaching out to.
I got a little tip here. It's just a short phrase, and I call it "leave it in the bag."
Yeah.
Back in the old days, sales reps carried a bag. A true story about a sales rep selling a brand super lightweight laptop to 1,000 field sales reps to outfit them, and she went in to meet with the VP of sales, and she didn't bring the product with her. She left it in the car, and eventually he got so excited after she found the pain and found the need and asked all these questions. He's getting fidgety. And the VP of sales go, are you going to show me the laptop? She goes, well, I left it in the car.
Yeah.
He got the deal.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it's more important. I always, challenge my reps. The first thing that they want is product knowledge. And I'm like, pause, before you know anything about Chorus, I want you to know our 4 different types of buyers. We sell to sales leaders, SDR leaders, sales enablement, and sales operations, and customer success. So I'm like, get to know them. If you're going to be aggressive on knowing them before you know our product.
Love it.
Yeah, so the body is the middle line, and then the CTA I have is the shortest line where you're requesting one time. I don't do multiple, just one time, to unpack the content above.
Becc, do you have a recommendation for the length? What's too long?
Yeah.
Long enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. 3 lines, 4 lines max.
I love it.
And lines, not pair. I mean, I'm just thinking the reason I'm brutal on my reps, BTW, we're hiring. The reason I'm brutal on them is because I know how I operate as a buyer.
Yep.
So the biggest thing that's on my side is that I'm an inductive thinker in the way of I think about my buying experience. And when I say send me an email to someone, what I really mean by that and why I'm telling them to send me an email. So I'm very introspective of my own buying behavior. So I'm training them basically to learn how to sell to someone as non-responsive as me. So that's kind of the bar.
And you know what? Speaking of short, texting, we're finding out through research is really on the rise. So you're not going to text anything.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's actually one of the pillars. So it's a really good segue. So now we know like the structure of an email, but I wanted to create 7 different flavors in the background of flavors and techniques that you should integrate. And then 7 deadly sins of what to stay away from in your outreach. So I want to make sure we're cognizant on time here. So I'll be pretty brief about these. The 7 pillars of attractive messaging are the 7 techniques that I have my reps deploy in every single message that they write. The first, I listed them in terms of what I see people do poorly to what I typically see people do well. So the first that I lead with is prospect centric. I have them write every single message, every single word of their email is about the prospect as opposed to our company. So even in terms of social proof, a lot of people want to give social proof and they always give like LinkedIn for some reason as a big social proof label or, that people integrate. But even in terms of social proof, I make it about my buyer. So I say, instead of saying we work with Slack, I would say we work with companies like you in terms of size, for example, Slack. So I'd make every single thing, prospect of like, I always counter to them because I want to know, I mean, at the end of the day, I know about my product. What I don't know is about them, you know? And so I want to position every single thing that I know about them, you know, beforehand. So, I mean, even today for the webinar, for instance, you know, I've done quite a bit of research on you, Bob, and I've watched a lot of your different things. And I know that we had met a year and a half ago, and I have all of that rolling in my brain if I ever get the chance to meet someone like you, because I'm like, I mean, we're talking to EVPs, SVPs, you know, CROs, C-level. If your company has hired you as an SDR to get someone on the phone, it's typically someone who is, you know, we should respect. They spent 15 or 20 years, you know, within the industry. They're really successful at their job. So if I get them on the line live, I want to know every single last thing about them so that I can tease out which reason I want to use within outreach and where. Second one is pain centric. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Talk about their pain points that you alleviate versus the benefits that you add. The third is pride aversive. If I were to attribute my success via email or my team's success to anything, it would be pride aversion. So Bob, I want to ask you a question. If you were to go out and meet someone, whether this is a friend or a first date, and you were to ask someone, tell me about yourself. Let's role play this. I want you, we're meeting for the first time, and I want you to say, hi, tell me about yourself. So, hi, Bob. It's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Becc. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I mean, that's hard to do because I'm awesome. I mean, I'm at a great company. My CEO really, really loves me. You know, my boss, VP of marketing, she just loves the work that I do. I'm crushing it at the gym. You know, my family, I hang out with my nieces and nephews. They adore me. So really everything in my life is perfect.
Go ahead.
Time out. What do you think about me right now?
Well, you're kind of stuck on yourself a little bit. Yeah. I was going to call you Superwoman, but.
Okay, let me ask you another question. Do you want the conversation to continue?
I do.
You do?
Well, I do, but I'm gonna switch it up on you and kind of try to get to the, you know, to your challenge. Yeah. But yeah. No, okay. No, get me off the phone.
Yeah. So exactly. So it's odd within our humanity. You know, our goal is that we want to build rapport with our buyer, and for some reason, how we do it is by talking well of ourselves. You know, we talk about how we're the number one in the market, we're the market leader, you know, we have all these wonderful clients, and these clients are wonderful. You know why those clients are wonderful? Because they work with me, you know, and it's to me of when I come across all of this lingo, it's like, you know, everyone doesn't like ego because everyone deep down has it. Right. So, I mean, myself included. Right. It's just a really unattractive flavor. So I have my reps stay away from any kind of prideful language of, you know, we're good at what we do and we like to help our customers. But if I'm going to fan out about anyone, I fan out about my prospect, and I fan out about their career trajectory. And
Becc, that you know, brings up another point here. You really shouldn't ever put down a competitor either.
No.
Right.
We'll get into that in Deadly Sins, but that's one of them is mudslinging, is what Sarah says about Sally says more about Sarah than Sally. So I always, you know, when I'm talking to my prospect, I like to fan out about them. The second piece of pride aversion is the reason my prospects don't respond to me, if they don't, is not because they're bad people. It's because I wasn't compelling enough in the message. So I do a lot of follow-up emails where I say something like, you know, hi, Bob, reason for my outreach is I was reading this article the other day about being relevant to your buyer, and I was convicted about the message I sent you. Being a sales effectiveness platform, we should know better. You know, with your permission, I'd like another shot at earning some of your time. So I put that accountability on me as a communicator versus them for not responding. So it's odd enough, but I see a lot in later stages of outreach, people being like, you know, hey, I messaged you several times, but you didn't respond. I guess you're either swallowed by a shark or just don't value data or don't want to enable your team. And it's bizarre of like, that is best practice in our industry, is to send the breakup email and talk all of that accountability on the buyer versus my ability to communicate. So I mean, I am a fan of the breakup email and maybe a later discussion for a later time, but I take accountability for someone not responding as opposed to making them feel like a bad person.
And Becc, they're getting so old.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you're kidding me, right?
It's like, hey, Bob, let me waste some more of your time and not add any value and make you feel bad for not responding. But any rate, the fourth pillar here is fluidity. I want to be short in here so we stay on time. Fluidity, be sure to, like we mentioned earlier, connect your premise to your body, to your CTA. Really easy in theory, really hard in practice to do. So if I see people messing up in here, it's usually because they're doing multi-value props as opposed to just one. My suggestion would be pick one value prop per email and drill it home. As opposed to saying we do X, Y, and Z, for people, because it's not their job to understand what you do. You need to give this, 7-year-old version of, hey, I saw you did this. What if you could do this, but quicker? Give me a shot to unpack that. Relevance, again, I would base all of my, messaging on buyer persona. We sell to sales development leaders and sales leaders. They're very different. What they care about is different. So I see a lot of people reaching out to me talking about closed revenue. And I'm like, I care about that, because I work for Chorus and I want them to do well. But as a sales dev leader, I care about one thing, meetings. So if you're going to talk to me in terms of that. Brevity, never use 7 words when 4 words will do. And then the 7th pillar is noticeability. So this is all in the subject line. The 3 goals of a subject line from my perspective is to get an open, avoid the spam filter, and then get an open without a bait and switch. So just so you know, one of the most heavily responded to email campaigns of all time the subject was pictures of your wife cheating on you. And in the body, it was a weight loss campaign saying if you didn't lose weight, that your wife would cheat on you. And it went viral and got a ton of nasty responses. So the open rate was like 100, but everyone felt dumb whenever they opened the email. So I would always say that whatever's in your subject line, you need to make sure ties into what your company does. So those are the 7 flavors of what to do. Let's talk quickly about what not to do, and then we'll transition to cold calls. The first deadly sin I see in messaging is being too casual or too silly, sending over gifts, starting with an email of, hey, Bob, as opposed to hi, giving the list of you must have been swallowed by a shark or, off on an island partying somewhere, or don't value what your reps are saying on the phone. Number 2, keep in mind, this seems odd that I'm listing all of these of what not to do, but I harvested these off of all of the emails that my reps have sent, people have sent in the past on my teams and have been sent to me. So this is all very, very, heavy within our industry. So it's bizarre, but I'll keep going. Number 2, wasted text. I know you're busy, but I just want to follow up here. Just want to circle back. I'd love to. Number 3 is being the authority over your prospect. We have 3 ego states within our being. We have the child ego state, we have the parent ego state, and we have the adult ego state. Within the child ego state, you have 2 ego states. You have the natural ego state, which is likes bubbles, likes roller coasters, really impressed by small things. And then you have the adaptive ego state, which is basically the rebellious teenager smoking cigarettes underneath the bleachers. So if you talk to your prospect in the parent ego state by commanding them, they'll flip into the child adaptive ego state and want to rebel against whatever you're saying. So think about whenever you tell someone, do not push this button, the first thing, what do they want to do? Push the button, right? So I would be careful of, ever commanding my prospect to do anything. And these things are small, but they all stack up within your messaging. So telling your prospect to let you know something, let me know what time works for you, starting with just their first name, like starting an email with Bob, comma, or I'd be happy to give you a demo. And it's like, well, no, duh, that's your job. The 4th one, questioning the prospect's authority. I'll ask you a question here, Bob. If I asked you if you're the decision maker and you are the decision maker, what do you feel like right now?
You know nothing about me.
Yeah, bingo. So let's transition. Well, let's say you're not the decision maker and I ask you if you're the decision maker. What do you feel like then?
Well, still like you haven't done your homework, I guess, but it just makes me feel less important than my role.
Bingo. So I think in either case scenario, if I am the decision maker and you ask me, are you? I'm like, yeah, kid, but so what?
Yeah.
If you ask me, are you the decision maker? And I'm not, I feel invalidated. And
Yeah.
so my, suggestion is always, regardless of whether this is, an intern or someone who takes out the garbage or someone who delivers food or a CEO or a vice president, always treat whoever's in front of you with respect.
Totally.
And add value to them. So asking them if they're a decision maker is a big no-no. Number 5, making your prospect feel not okay. Like you mentioned, the mudslinging. So, I mean, we have a couple competitors out there, and I just noticed if I talk poorly about someone, that looks bad upon me, not upon them. So, always within context of our competitors, I say they're a great platform. They're a great platform. The people who work with us typically want a little bit of X, more X. And that's why, they're engaging with us, but I always talk well of them. Number 6, making your prospect feel stupid, asking, do you know what we do? Or does that make sense? I cringe when I hear that of like, hey, Bob, does that make sense? It's like every time. What are you thinking if I ask you that? Does that make any sense?
Well, number 1, it's a closed-ended question, which is bad to begin with, right? So I'd rather, it's just sort of like, well, why don't you dig in a little bit deeper and ask me some open-ended questions so you get out of me, use the term how.
Yeah.
How do you see this possibly affecting your workflow?
Yep.
Right? Then I'll say, well, maybe it'll do this.
Yeah. So I always ask an open-ended question, but if I want to check for comprehension, I usually transition to, am I making any sense? As opposed to, does that make sense? So the onus is on me to communicate versus you to understand. And the seventh deadly, the seventh deadly sin is glorifying yourself. We touched a lot on this, talking how you're number 1, social proof where you're the hero. But basically, again, I would always focus on my prospect. If you're going to glorify someone, glorify your current clients and glorify the person that you're reaching out to if you're going to give glory to anyone. Yeah. So that's the 7 deadly sins. Let's get into call structure. Call structure. So I know we only have 13 minutes left here. So call structure, I want to typically work in personalization right off the bat. So this is just the beginning of the cold call structure, but I typically open with saying, hi, Bob, this is Becc calling on a recorded line with Chorus. How have you been?
I'm doing well. Yep.
I say, great. Glad to hear that. So the reason for my outreach is, I saw that you were a part of this webinar on personalization at scale, but more importantly, I saw this article that you wrote on LinkedIn the other day about scaling effective teams. So I was curious to know if you've come across Chorus before. So a lot of times in the beginning, they're going to ask me right here, like, hey, Bob, this is Becc on a recorded line with Chorus. How have you been? And they're going to say, recorded line with who? What? Or they'll ask me a question. What do you guys do? Or how are you different from this vendor? And every single time I say, that's a great question. And I go back into my personalization. It's easier to pitch what you do, but it's harder in the long run to book the meeting because I just did, again, what 99% of SDRs don't do. I researched you. And I want to prove to you up front that I have a lot of data on you. And so how I do that is by in the beginning saying the reason for my call is, and instead of talking about everything that you do as a company, talk about your prospect. I then transition into what's called a good old upfront contract. I'm sure you know this from Sandler, selling methodology. I got it off of them, but the 4 pieces to an upfront contract are the commitment, the agenda, the outcome, and consent. So it typically goes like this. I'll say, so I was curious to know if you've come across Chorus before. They'll say, no, I haven't. Or, you say, no, I haven't. Or you want to role play it from the top. Hey, Bob, this is Becc on a recorded line with Chorus. How have you been?
Good.
I'm good. Glad to hear that. Hey, Bob, the reason for my outreach is I saw that you were part of this webinar on personalization at scale. More importantly, I saw this article that you wrote on LinkedIn about scaling effective teams, really enjoyed it. And so I was curious to know if you've come across course before.
I've heard of you.
Oh, good. How was your experience so far?
Good, but we unfortunately we don't use the technology I think that it could fit into maybe.
Okay, got it. Well, how about this, Bob? You give me the next 30 seconds to give you my best dog and pony show on who Chorus is and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at AA-ISP. And at the end of that 30 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there. Fair?
I'm timing you, but go ahead.
So I want to get consent from my buyer to pitch.
Like it.
I don't personalize in there, but once you say, okay, you got it, I have about 98% conversion there. I go back into the personalization. So like I mentioned, I was really pulled in by this article that you wrote on scaling teams. At the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, VPs of sales care about quota attainment.
Yep.
And then I go into my typical buyer. So we typically work with VPs. So this is all I intertwine personalization within here in terms of buyer persona or what I'm bringing up. But the key for personalization, again, is this first part where they say, great, glad to hear that. And before they can hang up the phone, before they can do anything, I'm giving them the reality that I have. I mean, the CMO of Lyft once said, if you want 15 minutes of my time, you give me 5 by researching me first.
So that's a great. Hey, Becc, on that note, I got a good question for you, and that is, when you said, "Hey, I see you attended the personalization webinar, but more importantly, I noticed the post in LinkedIn that you talked about how to do pre-call research." And do you ever try to get, because that's got me. The minute you say, "I saw your article on pre-call research effectiveness," and I wrote it, you kind of got me hooked.
Yeah.
Just enough. Do you then try to let me feel proud about that, or let me talk a little bit? Oh yeah, I've been wanting to write that article for a long time, whatever, just so you kind of hook me in even further before you go into your, permission to continue your 30-second.
That is a great question. That I think I've never been asked that. I do, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Because if I bring up something, my goal is to shatter through the buyer persona, like the buyer-seller dance that we're in. They think I'm a cold caller. I want to get out of that as quickly as possible. So if you start talking about your webinar, I go there. I'm like, tell me about it. Tell me how's it going, and I feel the room. I mean, this is probably another session for another time. I do an hour-and-a-half section on objection handling. But if they break through that persona, they say, my weekend was great. I went to Tahoe. I say, do anything interesting? Yeah. So I went to this da-da-da-da. And I'm like, my biggest goal is right off the bat, your prospect's in fight or flight mode. And I want to break through that buyer-seller dance if they think I'm a skeezy salesperson. And the minute they give me permission to exit from that role, I absolutely do. So when they say like, yeah, so I was really nervous during that webinar, I didn't know if the headphones looked weird or da-da-da, I'd be like, no, why did you even think that?
I love it. Yeah.
And then we're off the thing. And then we get kind of to the side point in the meal is what I call it, of like when you're kind of full and you're like, and I'm like, well, great. So, hey, the reason for my, I wanted to talk to you a little bit of like, now that we're friends and we've built rapport, and I give them a little 30-second commercial. Like, I'd reach out because I have a 30-second commercial all prep for you. Are you good with me, go run it through it? And they'll be like, you got it. But that's a great question. And I'm like, I see, it's so funny to me that oftentimes, like, we're normal people until we get on the phone and then we're like, my name is blank and I am with, Visa. And it's like, what is going on?
I think the key is you are really bringing this challenge we have in the community here. This is a big challenge. I think what you're bringing to front, which I love, is you got to do the right type of personalization. And if you have some passion about it, it's going to come through. And like, if you have a genuine interest, that I wrote an article about pre-call research, which I know you would, right? You'd be like, man, you said this about pre-qual research. And I'd be like, yeah, you know why? And so,
yeah, I couldn't agree. I mean, I met a VP of sales at Pandora once, and I walked in. I still know him to this day because of this moment. I walked in, he said, I think we're connected on LinkedIn. I said, I think I've been following your career for the last 3 years. And I'm like, let me tell you the top 3 posts that you've made within the last year alone that has affected the trajectory of my sales career. And it's like, it was the truth for me. If
right.
I'm being genuine, like, hey man, you really helped me. And so let me try and add as much value as I can, because I'm nerding out a little bit, that I get to meet you. And so, I mean, the biggest thing that I'm doing, it's like, pride aversion is a big part of why I've seen a lot of success, or my teams have. But the other biggest thing is I'm encouraging them to be people. I'm encouraging them within structure, but I want to marry like the art piece and the science piece of like all the valuable capital of who you are. I don't want to hit the delete button on that. I want you to be, all the strengths that you have and who you are in terms of personality. I want you to marry that with some technique and some structure so that they know they're talking to a human being, but a human being who knows what they're doing on the phone.
Okay, Becc, I got you sidetracked. My apologies here.
No problem.
We're running down to the top of the hour.
So we're right on the top of the hour. So let me briefly go the next 4 minutes on how to scale it, and then we can go into any Q&A. How to scale it. The first question I ask teams is, what do you want to scale? I have a sneaky feeling that our goal was to scale results. And somewhere in there, because of the justification of this as an ops play, we ended up scaling volume instead. So the first question I have people be introspective on, or I am myself, is what do I want to scale? And for me, that is great conversations with people who are qualified. So the first thing that I do in terms of, by the way, this is how to do it within the outreach sales engagement platform, but full disclosure, you can do this in any sales engagement platform. I wanted to be very, open of like, I'm using outreach today, but even in a week, I'm going to be doing a webinar on how to do it in InsideSales.com. So there's Groove, there's Guessware, there's Sales Loft, just to name a couple of the other players. But today I wanted to show how I built it out in outreach. But if you go to outreach, I mean, every time I call a prospect, typically I don't get a pickup on the first time. So I wanted to make sure of when I've seen reps personalize in the past, they're housing all of this and storing all of this information in Google Sheets. But how I wanted to speed that up is basically I built into outreach, and you can go to your CSM if you're using them. Within the custom fields, I built in every single premise reason that you could do outreach. So I simply, when I'm evaluating someone, I use my friend Scott Barker for this. I go to his prospect page within outreach, I hit edit, and then it comes up with all these fields, these custom fields. I throw it in there, I hit save, and then every single time that I call Scott, it bubbles to the top within outreach, the LinkedIn articles that he wrote, the excerpts that I wanted to use, etc. So, I mean, again, it's like, it's all about, I had the pain point in the past of whenever I did get the person live, I'm scrambling through these sheets to figure out that reason. So how I sped it up and hit that Trish Bertuzzi activity metric, like the average activity metric, was by leveraging outreach. As far as sequences, I get asked a lot about this. My sequences that I build are what are called shell sequences. So I dictate which type of outreach I want them to be doing, whether that's email, cold call, or LinkedIn. But I give them just a shell of like, hey, you need to email on this day. But then I just put tailored title, like you can see here in the middle, tailored title, high first name, and then I put 7 pillars in the middle to remind them of what they should be doing. And then I tag with your success in mind. In terms of the sequence itself, I do 14 step sequence within 21 days, more heavy on the back end. If I'm more heavy on the front end and dissipate in the back end, I basically teach my prospect that if they just wait long enough, I'll go away. So I flipped that to where I'm more easy on the front end and then more aggressive on day 16, 17, 18. And then they finally pick up. They're like, I'm not going to get rid of this person unless I respond to them. So In terms of times of calling, I typically do 5 minutes before the hour or after the hour, more aggressively throughout the day and more aggressively throughout the week. So Hoffman did a study on this. And so basically Wednesday, Thursday, Friday from 2 to 6 p.m. are my go times for my team, because Monday morning I'm in internal meetings. I've got coffee in my stomach. I want to get my prospects whenever, they have the time to talk and they're looking for that one last little task to fulfill. And then the last slide here, I require quality, not request it. So I basically, I like how I say this after I said I was hiring. I block my reps from reaching out unless they've personalized. So within outreach, this sounds so psycho, but I'm like, I don't want them reaching out to my prospects unless I know who they are. So they're opted out of sequences until my reps fill in enough fields.
I love this. If it's not there, it doesn't exist. I got a question for you. Do you block time? I love your time frame for outreach. I think that's good. Do you have time frame for pre-call research?
I do. So at the beginning of a sequence, there's a LinkedIn step where they store 4 to 5 premises. So I have them do it at the first part of the sequence that fuels every single message from there.
Listen, you've blown up a theory that I hear from some sales leaders. I still hear today. I got to get my people out of LinkedIn. I got to get them on the phones. They don't understand this.
Yeah, you got to marry both. You got to marry both. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't use LinkedIn to book my buyer, but I use LinkedIn to understand my buyer, which is, from what I understand, what the purpose of the platform was. If I want to research my buyer and figure out everything that's important to Bob, but then when it comes to outreach, I do, within the 8 to 6 time frame, I want to be respectful of their off time. And then I want to be, again, so aggressive about knowing who they are. And then in terms of, in my experience, my prospects, you're aggressive and you're personalized, they're not mad. You're aggressive and you're unpersonalized, they get irritated. So I always have them of if you're going to be talking to an executive vice president of an enterprise firm at Splunk, then you need to know who that person is. Otherwise, they shouldn't give you any other time. So,
and then once again, viewers, thanks for joining. Understand if you got to jump off, other commitments, but we're going to get to Q&A. Thanks for sending in some Q&A. We'll get to that just in a couple minutes.
Yeah. So, that's basically it. I put a summary slide here. In summary, I know that it's tough. It's really tough to personalize. It's tough to understand the structure of it. It's tough to really, really know your buyer. But I think we have a really great opportunity here. And the opportunity is to be humans again on the phone, to know who our buyer is, and most importantly, to sell with integrity. And I think the landscape is hungry for people who are, they're not the skeezy salesperson. They're not the person who's trying to push product, but they're the person who's a true consultant, who's genuine, authentic, and wants to understand the needs of their buyer. And they start with researching them beforehand. So that's basically it. Thanks so much for having me today.
Well, Becc, it was a treat. I'll make a quick, I'll communicate this, the one slide we have up here, then we're going to go right into Q&A. Please stay with us if you can. If not, we understand. Roy Renani, who is the CEO and co-founder of Chorus, is actually going to be out in Boston, Norwood, Massachusetts with us in a couple weeks on September 12th. And please come and join us there. So, Becc, here we go. I'm gonna queue up some questions for you here, and I'll try to get as many as I can.
Okay, great.
Using LinkedIn Navigator, and which platform is all this residing?
I'm sorry. Can you say that question again?
Yep. Are you using LinkedIn Navigator?
Yes, I am using LinkedIn Navigator very heavily. I would say I personally use LinkedIn more. I just kind of more parochial view. I don't use Salesforce Lightning. I use Salesforce Classic. But I actually met with an SDR the other day, and they were talking about, and I want to do more digging, and then I was going to pull it into some content. There is a way to view your prospects or your network in regards to who are the top 100 people who have posted within the last 30 days. So it's a way to sequence based on who's been active on LinkedIn. So I want to do a little more digging, but Yes, I use LinkedIn Navigator, and I do use LinkedIn. I store all of my premises like I showed you within Outreach. I store all of them within there.
And then one that came in a while ago, if you use time personalizing emails and consequently send less, like you mentioned, how would you tackle the challenge of the prospect not seeing them at all?
Oh, that's a great one. So first, I'd be diagnostic as to what my subject line is.
Yeah.
So I usually do a subject line that says your article on LinkedIn, and I have like 85 to 95% open rate.
Love it.
So I usually I'm tailored in my subject line would be my first guess of why they're not opening it. But there's the reality of bad data in some cases. And it's like, sometimes you can't get the right email or the right phone number. And in that case, I go straight to LinkedIn.
I have a thing I try to teach, and that is use the word you or your in the first line. And you took that up a notch. You use you or your in the subject line.
Yep. I do. I'm like, your article on LinkedIn, your time at AA-ISP. And then it's like, I would click that, so I'm, again, being really evaluative in terms of what I would open.
This next question comes up all the time at our conferences, and it has to do with call recording regulations, FCC regulations, especially a two-party state. How often do you get pushback from, this is Bob calling on a recorded line?
Yeah, you mean pushback from prospects is what
yes.
Okay. Yes. Pushback from prospects within the sales cycle, it certainly is an objection. It comes up, especially with GDPR. We want to make sure that we're super compliant. We could spend 30 minutes there on how we're compliant, but I will just say this. We couldn't be a firm if we didn't have an answer to that objection. We couldn't be a company. So the best practice that I deploy in terms of cold calling, because you're already on the uphill struggle to book a meeting, is I hit, hi, Bob, this is Becc on a recorded line with Chorus. How have you been? So I give them awareness, that they are being recorded. And a lot of times within the cold calls themselves, they'll say like, well, what about call recording, giving notice? And then I'll say, do you remember at the beginning of the call that I said record it? And they'll be like, oh, I get it. And I actually get a ping notification. I want to know any single time that my rep does not hit compliance, because it is a huge deal. So anytime, if it were to ever happen, it doesn't, but if it were to ever happen, I would get an email notification right away that my rep just called and did not hit compliance. And so it's a very, very strict conversation, because we always are aiming, GDPR is a great thing, and we want to make sure, that we're always compliant with our buyers.
And that's just with two-party states, is that correct?
Two-party, but if you're selling into two-party states as well. So everyone's typically selling across the US. So it's like California, New York, et cetera, like Boston. If you're selling anywhere in there, then you have to hit compliance. So I would always rather be safe than sorry. And I have my reps do it on every single call.
Okay, great. From John, how do you handle prospects that haven't written an article, gotten a recent promotion, and have no shared connections on LinkedIn people? Are you sure you want this person to be your prospect? No, just kidding. Or a common college.
I would always want to ask someone more questions. I understand we don't have that luxury. I would say, if you can't find anything within self-authored content they've engaged with, self-attributed traits, keep in mind, that was one I didn't hear in that list of like profile line, headline, company line. You're talking Twitter, Facebook. Then the last bucket I line is firmographic. Yeah. What is their company doing? What kind of blog post language on LinkedIn are they talking about? I would use firmographic data, but I will say this, full disclosure. I mentioned it's like 90% within the first three buckets that I can find a premise. I'd say 95 that I can find it within the junk drawer in the first three. So I will say, full disclosure, that if you are exhaustive of that list that I gave you, you will very, very rarely end up in that fifth bucket. So I end up in the fifth bucket only, when need be. But if you have a very highly technical buyer, I get asked that question a lot. A lot of technical buyers, they are not on LinkedIn. They kind of see that as a capital of their mysterious.
Yeah.
Then I go to, junk drawer premises, or again, company premises are always going to be on there. The company's going to be talking, their about me section or website language or M&A or hiring needs.
Yeah. And Becc, I would say occasionally you're outside of LinkedIn, right? Nothing's stopping you from Google search.
I go Twitter, I go Facebook, I go Instagram, I go whatever I have to. I mean, within the rules of I have to link whatever premise I pick. I mean, a joke that one of my reps said, this is about 1.5 years ago, he said, "Hey, Bob, I noticed when I broke in your house this morning that you like chocolate." And we all just erupted laughing, So I would say, I would caution whoever asked the question, or I would politely remind of I find it hard to believe that you couldn't have found a premise within those first 4 buckets, that they haven't written anything, liked anything, shared anything, commented on anything, don't have a profile line, have no headline, have no company line, no school, mutual connect. There's so many premises you could go within those first 4 buckets.
Okay, so here we go. Let's see. How do you tie in a premise while leaving a voicemail while keeping it short?
Oh, that's a great question. So I typically say hey, this is Becc Holland calling you. Reason for my outreach is I'm the annoying rep that's been jamming your inbox with emails. The real reason for my original outreach, though, was I saw you wrote this article on blank. It really resonated with me. One line that had caught my attention was hiring the right people is just as important as developing them. I wanted to see if you were willing to give me a shot, a 30-second commercial, my best 30-second commercial, to try and earn some of your time. If you're willing and open to give me that shot, call me at 214, and I give my number. Either way, what you're doing is so impactful, and I hope you're having a great start to the quarter. Great. So I basically tie in the reason for outreach within the voicemail. So it's about a 30-second voicemail in total.
Yeah, good. I like the 30-second, keep it short. And then how are your SDRs getting through gatekeepers, which there seems to be less and less of, by the way?
Yeah, I mean, gatekeepers are tough. I would say always go for a direct dial over anything. And people understand it nowadays just because, within technology, we've traded privacy for convenience to a degree. But gatekeepers, I always ask the person, and I try and build as much rapport as I can. So when they say, "Why are you calling Rob?" I would say, "I saw this article." I'm personalized even there. And I would say, is there any way that you can get me, in front of him for 30 seconds?
Yeah.
For 30 seconds. So I try and build a relationship there. And when they pass me through, I always say, "Wish me luck." And they start laughing. Yeah. Because I want to be in the mentee chair with them. So that's usually how I handle gatekeepers. But we could even do a 15-minute session on that alone. But that's kind of the high level.
And then if you're striking out at, say, phone or email, and you want to do a LinkedIn message, do the same principles apply if you're doing an in-mail or a LinkedIn?
Yes.
Even a connection request?
Yeah. Connection request, I never personalize. Connect. Because when someone sends me a connection request and they try to sell to me in that, I decline it. I'm the quickest way for me to know what you're after is I decline it. I add the person, and I will say if someone adds me and then immediately pitches me, I remove the connection.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But what about a connection request that said, "Hey, Becc, a great personalization webinar. I learned a lot. Let's connect."
Totally. I always accept those. And I'm I want to leverage LinkedIn. I want to be appropriate. I want to be appropriate and polite. And, that's the kind of rep I want to be. So in terms of in-mail, it depends. I mean, it's a long topic, but basically, in-mails, I try and be as personalized as possible. If I'm not getting any kind of opens and any kind of cold calls, I understand you have to resort to LinkedIn. I always add my buyer at the beginning because I want to see in my feed, I want to like their posts, make comments on it. So when I reach back out, I've invested in them, so they're more likely to invest in me.
Look, I got a quick story for you. I get a ton of these that go right into pitch mode, but I got one the other day. "Hey, Bob, I had a chance to visit the Boston chapter of the AA-ISP. It was a great event. I learned so much. Thanks for supporting this." And I "Wow, great. Let's stay connected." And then he reaches out and he said, yeah, this is what our company does. I'd like to review it with you. I'm taking that meeting for a lot of different reasons, but I wouldn't have if he said our company does this. Can we get a meeting? Wouldn't have done it.
Totally.
Oh, Dana wants you to do a section on gatekeepers. That's the last comment I think that we have for today.
Okay, great. Sounds like I'm coming back, Bob.
All right. Well, we love it. This is all. And we really appreciate the fact that we didn't talk anything about Chorus, but I do want to mention that Chorus is a leading call assessment coaching tool. We're excited to have you as part of the community. There's lots of platforms out there, but if you're not doing this, you need to consider it. And I even know a lot of what you learned is from researching and assessing some of the recorded calls that you do record. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So if anyone wants to know more about Chorus, obviously my email's up there. More, obviously open to start a conversation, but I always want to make it more about the content. That's what really excites me. So, but if anyone wants the slide deck, you can either email me at becc.holland@chorus.ai, and I'll be sure to get the slide deck out to you, or I think you guys are going to do a follow-up, correct?
Yeah, we will send out an email as well, giving everyone a link to access the slides. This was fantastic. I know we went over time. Our apologies, but it's a great topic. Let's keep this personalization thing alive. And, Chorus is taking the lead here. I love that. Those of you on the call, please keep this alive because we gotta fix it. This is an epidemic, right? Yeah. And everybody that does this, in fact, AA-ISP will be following up, I'm sure, thanking you for attending. If we don't personalize that, send me the email and I'll talk to our staff about it. So, yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Becc, thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.